here, February 18, and I would like to begin by asking for approval of our meeting minutes from January 29. I trust everyone has received them and has had an opportunity to review them.
I second the motion.
Do we hear a motion?
Mr. Foxwell, this is AV support, and I just wanted to check, can we begin recording the meeting?
Yes, you may.
Thanks.
I'm going to go back in that case and start from the beginning. I'd like to request approval of the January 29 meeting minutes. Do we have a motion to approve?
I second the motion.
Okay. Motion second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. And I'd like to now go to Mr. Hatcher for his executive director's report.
Okay. First off, we'll start with acknowledging that the MOU was signed directly after the meeting, our last meeting. It is now in force, and all work has been started within the ATC. From that time forward, we have issued about 135 alcohol licenses and permits. Since the meeting, Mr. Merced and myself have completed the Open Meetings Act training. And my office is monitoring several current bills pending with the legislature that have hearings coming forth this coming Friday and March the 5th. And I'll update at our next session the results of its following from those bills and where they stand.
Tony, is the
and later.
Go ahead.
And directly after this, when we get down to the section for General Assembly updates, myself and Mr. Kelly will be giving a brief overview of some of the bills of consequence that we might be looking at directly.
Tony, is tomorrow's bill or tomorrow's hearings in Economic Matters or in the Senate EHE committee?
I am not positive. Mr. Foxwell, I'll have to take a look at that while we continue, and I'll see if I can get that real quick. Okay.
Is Jeff on the call?
Yep, I'm on. Yeah, I do know. I do know. I was just looking at that information. I have the luxury of looking at it while you're asking while Tony's on the hot seat. So yeah, tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, all of this is in the House side in Economic Matters.
Okay.
And there are a handful of bills that'll be presented at 11 o'clock in Economic Matters that are statewide bills, meaning simply that the laws affect all the jurisdictions in the state. And then beginning at 1:30 on Friday afternoon, and then you'll be able to weigh in on this. Beginning at 1:30, the local bills begin. Those hearings are typically very, very long. They are comprised of local interests that affect generally only one jurisdiction, and there's oftentimes a little bit more motion that follows these bills as opposed to those statewide bills. So 1:30 for the local bills, 11 o'clock for the statewide bills.
What, Mr. Kelly, thank you. What the Field Enforcement Director is referring to is what is casually known inside Annapolis as Booze Day. And it's not nearly as enjoyable as the title might indicate. Drinks are not served. This is a long, long day for advocates, government officials, the committee members and staffers themselves. And as Jeff suggested, the statewide legislation will begin at 11:30. All the local bills will be heard at 1:30, and it will go, if passed as prelude, well into the evening. We've been there in times, and Betty's smiling here. We've gone well into 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, sometimes later. So if you have a slow afternoon and you want to see democracy in action, you want to see how alcohol legislation gets made, rejected, or modified, log in, and you get to do it again in March when the process moves over to the Senate for the Education, Health, and Environmental Matters Committee, which hears alcohol legislation in that chamber. So tomorrow, Booze Day. So, anything else for the executive director's report, Mr. Hatcher?
No,
Wonderful.
no.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to stay with Mr. Hatcher and Mr. Kelly. I thought it would be instructive for all the members, as well as those who might be listening in, who may not be familiar with the regulations and laws that have got us to this point, perhaps to have an overview. And we're not going to get this. I don't think this is going to be a very deep dive, but I think it's going to be a generalized overview of the framework of alcohol regulation and statute in the state of Maryland, and kind of the guiding principles that govern what Jeff and Tony and their respective staffs do and what we are being asked to do as newly appointed commissioners of the ATC. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and Tony, and I hope you find this as instructive and as fascinating as I did the first time I heard it. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Len. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. Jeff has an excellent presentation to give to the board, and I'll let him continue from there.
Okay, so bear with me if you will. I'm going to try and do a share screen thing, which I'm not. Well, you'll learn about my technological capabilities in just a minute or two. But bear with me as I try to do this. Is anything showing up here yet for you guys?
I see it.
Oh, okay.
See the
Let me also I'm going to qualify again what I'm about to say is that a lot of I can't see what you can see now. So if I'm not doing this right along the way, please let me know. I'm just not sure that I'm going to be able to see it the way you see it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take you from a very quick walk from pre-Prohibition, getting us to Prohibition, and then what happened after Prohibition, and then finish it up with what Maryland looks like. It'll be kind of a quick overview, and I'll tell you, when I first got into this, what I knew about alcohol was you had to be 21 to drink, and bars had to close at 2. There's a whole world behind all of this, and this is going to be old hat for Tony and for Len and Betty, who all know this stuff very much. Otherwise, it might be new for most people. So interestingly enough, all of this began with beer years ago. Wine and spirits were really just on the fray, but beer was the popular drink. And it was not just specifically beer, but it was beer that came in from overseas. Before Prohibition, the brewers that were around were in Europe, and their goal was to have one saloon for every 285 people in any given area, which is a lot. Chicago actually had one saloon for every 150 to 200 people. That's 7,300 legal saloons. So one to almost, they certainly met that goal in Chicago, but they also had about 1,000 illegal saloons. So there were a lot of saloons, legal and not. And if you think about when you go into major cities, you'll often see a bar or tavern on every corner. That's a result or remnant still of wanting to have so many saloons for so many people. How did you get into business? You had to come up with $200. That was a lot of money. You had to come up with $200 of your own. But if you did that and you showed that level of commitment, then the brewers would set you up. They'd find you the location. They'd get all the equipment that you need. But there was a downside to that. They also would tell you what product you could sell. Well, that was only the product of that particular brewer. So if you took their money and you took their location and their equipment and went into business, they told you what you could sell. That is something today that we call a tied house, which is a prohibitive action wherein a manufacturer demands and decides what a person can sell and then only allows them to sell. That's an illegal action today, but that's what was occurring pre-Prohibition. You also have to buy only the beer that this manufacturer sells, and you have to pay a premium. So the free location and free equipment wasn't free at all. You paid a premium on the cost of your beer, your alcohol, in order to get into that location. You were pressured to sell more beer and more beer and more beer. And remember, while they're trying to get you to sell their beer, they're setting up shops all around you and trying to get those people to do the same thing. So what did you have to do? You had to do something to entice more customers to come in. You offered free meals. You started offering illegal gaming. You allowed prostitution and drugs to be brought into your establishments. You did anything you could to meet the growing pressure of the brewers to have you sell more beer. Today we have prohibitions against all of these things happening in liquor stores, including free meals. You can't entice people into your locations by giving something free. So what happened as a result? Overconsumption, terrible overconsumption. Public order and decorum vanished. Crime increased. People were hurt. They were lying in the roads, drunk. Families and communities being torn apart. So then we got it. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment. As a result, a federal law went into effect called the Volstead Act. And the Volstead Act made it federally illegal to manufacture and distribute alcohol. But it was a federal action, and it required the states to act as well. So each state was required to create what would be called enabling legislation that carried out the requirements of the Volstead Act. One state in the Union, and only one state in the Union, chose to not create any kind of legislation to support the Volstead Act. I'll let you guess what that was in your own minds. It was Maryland. We were the only state to not carry out the federal regulations of the Volstead Act. And some say that's where the birth of our state's motto, the Free State, came from. We were chastised by other states for not having any sort of complementary legislation. And one of our editors said Maryland ought to secede from the nation rather than support prohibition. And we were called then the Maryland Free State. So then this experiment didn't work and prohibition comes to an end. And there was a study conducted that J.D. Rockefeller, I believe it was J.D. Rockefeller supported. And the study said a couple of things. It said, one, okay, if we're going to allow alcohol, states need to control all of it. They need to control the manufacturing. They need to control the distribution. They need to control the sale to retailers, to customers rather. So they need to do all of this. The states need to be that entity. And Maryland said, no, we're not going to do that. So then the study said, if you're not going to be a control state, which you'll hear that term as you continue in your service as commissioner, if you're not going to be a control state, then we recommend you become a licensing state, meaning that the state, at the state level, will license people to manufacture alcohol, will license people to be wholesalers, and will license people to be retailers. And Maryland said, nah, we're not quite with that either. So what did we do? Well, Maryland did subscribe to the three-tier system, which means you have a manufacturing system, manufacturers, that's tier one, and a very bright line that divides them from tier two, who are the wholesalers, and then another bright line that divides them from the retailers who sell to consumers. So we did establish that, but we made it so that Maryland regulates and licenses the manufacturing and the wholesale distribution of alcohol. But they left it up to each of our 25 licensing jurisdictions to license retailers and to control how it gets to consumers. The state certainly has the authority to enforce these local requirements, but it's the local boards who have the regulatory authority to take action against these retailers as well as the licensors. So I kind of mentioned this now. Maryland licenses and regulates the manufacturers and distributors. The local jurisdictions regulate the retailers, and together we share responsibility for enforcing all of the provisions of the retailer. So this is what I was saying about the three tiers and the bright line between them. On the left, you see tier one, the manufacturing supplier tier. And that's a variety of licenses and where they can be found in law that currently exist in Maryland as manufacturers. They're only allowed to sell their product in our system to the second tier, which are the wholesaler distributor tier. Again, we have a variety of different types of wholesalers who are allowed to do different things, but that's the second tier. And then theoretically, the only way it gets to the retailer tier, manufacturer sends it to the wholesaler, wholesaler to the retailer, who sells to the consumer. Tier three is the retailer. So that's what we think and what we intend our distribution system to look like. But it doesn't always look that way. In fact, a variety of laws that we have in Maryland put in some instances, and you'll see it by the light blue color in the left-hand column, some of what should be a wholesaler and distributor actually become the manufacturer supplier. They become the tier 1 supplier. They do that when a wholesaler perhaps orders wine from out of the country that isn't manufactured here, and they become the first entity in Maryland to possess this product, and perhaps even in the United States, they become the supplier. So you can see, while we think we have a very clean, clear distribution system, in fact, we don't. It's rather complex. And it gets more complex when you start to understand who's allowed to sell directly to consumers, who has to sell to whom, where product comes from. So it starts to get a little bit jumbled and a little bit thrown together. And let me say, anywhere I mention the Comptroller of Maryland, I'm going to take this off of, if I can figure it out, I'm going to take this off of share. Anywhere I mention the Comptroller of Maryland, now substitute that to the Alcohol and Tobacco Commission. This is a series of information that I had from some time ago. But it's now you guys who bear the burden of regulating and licensing our manufacturers and our wholesalers, and who share in the enforcement actions against and for and with the local retailers and the local boards.
Hey, Jeff, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So could you just give me a brief overview then how the FAA, or the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, applies here, and how a special occupational tax imposed by the federal government is handled by the state?
So I'll be honest, I don't know anything about the occupational tax necessarily. At least that's not familiar to me. The FAA, I think it was 1934 or so, came out somewhere in that range.
Right.
And that didn't do a whole lot. One thing it did is it said that beer is a little bit of a different alcoholic product than spirits and wine. And you'll see as you get more involved in these things that, in fact, beer, you'll see that we have regulations and laws toward beer, and then we have regulations and laws toward spirits and wine, which are handled differently. And that was one of the elements of the FAA. But for the most part, the federal government said, you know what, now that we're allowing alcohol back in here, we're leaving it to the states to control. And I think their initial intent was probably to say, we're staying out of it entirely and let every state do it the way they want. However, and as a matter of reality, they can't quite break away from that entirely. There are Commerce Clause issues and other things we have to consider.
And does the state of Maryland tax the alcohol content that's manufactured in the state?
I'm sorry, say that again?
So from a federal level, the alcohol content, the proof is taxed by the government, by the federal government, but is that also taxed by the state?
Yes, good question. All of the alcohol, the federal government reserves the right to tax all of the alcohol. So they do that whether it's made in Maryland or outside of Maryland, doesn't matter. They tax all of it. And then in Maryland, we tax it as well. And it gets taxed in a variety of different ways. Again, back to the difference between beer and wine and spirits.
Yep.
When wine and spirits comes into Maryland, and that means somebody from outside of the state shipped it into the state, one of our wholesalers, or it means one of our manufacturers made it in the state and now have it to a state of readiness that it can be sold. That's when it officially enters the state. At that moment, their federal tax is paid, but their state tax is not. It comes into the state not tax-free, it's tax not yet paid when it comes into the state. And then the taxes on that product aren't due until they actually distribute the product to a retailer.
Gotcha.
So the taxable event is when it leaves the wholesaler's warehouse and goes to the retailer. That's wine and spirits. For beer, again, the feds will tax it whenever it's in the state, whenever it's manufactured, it'll tax it. But we do require prepayment of beer. So when beer enters the state, whether it's from Budweiser out of the state or from Heavy Seas in the state, it's taxed the moment it's ready to be sold as beer or the moment it enters our state. That's when a taxable event takes place.
Got it. And for distilled spirits in the state of Maryland, is it $13.50 per proof gallon?
It's $1.50.
$1.50.
$1.50 a gallon, if you can believe that. It's pretty low.
Okay.
Yeah. Just while we're there, it's $1.50. Beer is 8 cents, I think, and wine is 40 cents. And
Okay.
the only difference with spirits is you mentioned proof gallon, and I think a proof gallon is considered 100% proof or 50% alcohol.
Yes.
Any amounts over that, there is an additional charge. It's not much, but there is an additional charge for the spirits based on the percentages as they gain beyond 100 or 100 proof.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Len, you're on mute.
Jeff, can you hear me?
Yeah, gotcha.
Before everyone logged on, I was having a conversation with Betty. We were taking a trip in the Wayback Machine to 2008. as you were talking about the various the tax rates for the various forms of alcohol beverages, and the disparity between the tax rate for spirits and beer has led to a couple of interesting pieces of legislation through the years. I recall the Alcopops legislation, for one of a much better term, because Alcopops had elements in the manufacturing process of both beer and spirits. And as you can imagine, the difference between 7 cents per gallon and $1.50 per gallon times all the product that's being distributed and sold around the state, it was real money to somebody. And there were also public health implications because these things were being disproportionately marketed to underage consumers and young consumers. And so those disparities have led to a couple of interesting legislative battles through the years.
They do, and it's interesting when you consider alcohol as a genre, if you will. It's one of the larger genres of bills that get introduced each year. There's so much interest in it for a variety of reasons. The taxing of it, the different types of products that are allowed, the different venues that want to sell it. It is one of the largest groups of bills each year in the General Assembly.
And Jeff, do you mind if I ask another question?
At your convenience.
Okay, so if you have let's say you have a manufacturer of alcohol, let's say it's a distillery, and they sell their product at the location. So they manufacture it on the premises and they sell it. How do they avoid the tied house issues related to distribution?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Well, first of all, I don't know that they're mandated to sell only their product because it is their place. It's not my place, and they're forcing me to sell only their product. It's their own place, and they're electing to sell their own product. But even beyond that, so there's no coercion, I guess is what I'm saying there. But even beyond that, the power of the General Assembly to create law, regardless of what it might look like, is pretty enormous. And in this case, relative to alcohol, unless the General Assembly says you may do something, you may not. You can't fill a void thinking you can do something. You can only do expressly what they tell you may do. And in this case, they expressly say that a distillery may sell the product that it produces. And so it's limited to the product it produces. So while they might even wish they could sell somebody else's, they can't. They can only sell their own because the General Assembly said that's the limit of it.
Okay. Jeff, thank you. Okay, proceed, Jeff, please.
No, that was the end of that. I'm happy to take any questions, or it's a lot, I know, and after a while it starts to grow on you. And I think Betty would tell you, I mean, and she's just terrific. She spent a lifetime in this, and it's a constant learning. It's constant learning. Things change, and I've been doing this in my role. I've been doing this for about 12 years, almost 13 years, I guess, and something new comes up all the time. It just
that's a great segue into another question. I'm sure Betty Buck will know the answer to this question as well. But malt beverages, how are those taxed in the state of Maryland?
Like a beer, 8 cents a gallon.
Okay.
And everything breaks down to essentially it's either taxed as a beer, a wine, or a spirit. But I'll just give you another interesting tidbit quickly about the strength or the legal strength of the General Assembly. Once you understand this more and more, you'll start to realize that mead, which is a honey-based wine, is by nearly every definition in the way it's manufactured a wine. But a couple of years ago, a couple of our larger sellers of mead in the state package it and sell it more similar to a way of it being a beer. But they were taxed at the 40-cent per gallon wine rate, and the tax wasn't the issue. It was truly the ability of how to distribute it. But they wanted to use beer distributors because they thought beer distributors were better for their particular type of product, but they were a wine. So they were limited to going to wine distributors, not beer distributors. We have rules. So they got a bill introduced and subsequently passed that even though mead is a wine, in Maryland, by law, it is a beer. So it's taxed like a beer and it's distributed like a beer. So it's a beer. Just to give you a sense of how strong the law is relative to determining how we regulate and make determinations.
And we're grateful that it is beer and it sells very well as a beer. But to answer your other question about at a distillery, why they only sell their own brands, we were all in favor of that because it works as a very good marketing tool for the small craft distillers. It helps them get people into their door so that it really is a good marketing tool for them and craft brewers as well. I mean, it's really good for our state, and it sells, you know, for like if somebody goes into the Slow Betty vodka, which I don't know it very well, but I know it's here in Maryland. It's great as a selling tool. If they go into that place, that they're going in there to buy a bottle, but they get to taste it first, so they know the great brand that's there. So we were all in favor of that because it's a great selling tool, but we don't want to open up yet another bar for them to go in to just go to another bar. We want them to go with that purpose of trying that great brand and seeing what it's all about. So that's why that was the great purpose.
Thank you, Betty. Jeff, I want to just put this into a modern day context because somebody who might be sitting in this presentation and hearing your outstanding overview for the first time might look at those three tranches, the manufacturer, the distributor, and the retailer, and say, well, wait a minute, you know, I get it, but there seems to be, as you indicated, a great deal of overlap between, especially in modern times, between the three stages of the alcohol distribution and sale process, the three-tier system. For example, the craft breweries and the craft distilleries that we've spoken of, they are both manufacturers of product, and now because of modifications to statute of recent years, their retail functions have expanded. So now they occupy two different segments of the three-tier system, and the extent to which a craft brewery that produces below a certain threshold of beer annually can also self-distribute, again with permission from the Maryland General Assembly. So they occupy another place in the three-tier system. Could you spend just a little bit of time, without going too far down the path, talking about some of the modifications that have occurred over recent years to accommodate the rising or the growth in Maryland's craft manufacturing sectors? And at the risk of putting you and Tony on the spot, if you could give me and my colleagues an updated number on how many breweries, wineries, and distilleries we have in Maryland right now operating. And that's, if you don't have it, it's also a number that Mr. Addicks may have available.
And I'm going to say I don't have it immediately. So if Tony wants to take a second while I answer your question to look that up real quick on our website, that'd be great.
And I apologize. I totally put you on the spot.
Nope, that's okay. I can tell you it's going to be roughly 100 brewers in the state, maybe close to that in wineries and distillers. Gosh, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 or so. I could be way off because I honestly haven't looked in a while. That's not my problem. That belongs to the Alcohol Tobacco Commission. So you understand. Teasing. So yeah, there's actually what's happened is interesting. You could be in your back room brewing beer, bottling beer, kegging beer. In your front room, you're serving to customers your beer who are in your what looks to be maybe a tavern, drinking your beer, and walk past them with your hand truck carrying cases of your beer outside to take to the liquor store down the street for sale. So in essence, you are manufacturing and retailing and wholesaling all from the same location. And that's what's happened. And it's happened for truly each of our tiers. Because now what you'll see is we have our manufacturing types. So let me just say in very broad terms, you have a winery manufacturer, a beer manufacturer, a spirits manufacturer. Then we've created very specific, unique, limited wholesalerships for each of them. So you have a winery or wine wholesaler, a beer wholesaler, and a spirit wholesaler, all limited, who are allowed to sell to retailers, all the while also many of them have their own retail operations on site. So it is not a bright line that divides these any longer. It's fuzzy, and you need special glasses to look at it and see the lines because they don't exist as broadly as before. But I would say this, all of that is a product. I mean, the General Assembly wields the power, certainly, but the alcohol industry is a huge industry in Maryland. When it goes from the server to the manufacturer and everybody in between, I've heard it's the second largest industry in the state, right after government. It's a huge industry and a huge economic driver. None of this happens because the General Assembly says so simply. It happens because the industry gets together and works in a very cooperative fashion. And I'll say my experience, and I have a very national knowledge, a very broad national knowledge. Maryland is quite unique in how well its variety of tiers and manufacturers work together. And it's a pleasure for us who've been involved in the regulating of it because it's not so nice in other states. This happens because our Maryland industry gets together and hammers out details and addresses problems, and then goes before the General Assembly and says, hey, we've got something for you. We've talked about this. We think we can make it work collectively. Here's what we present to you. And many of these significant changes that have taken place happen because of that kind of collaboration.
Jeff, thank you. Do we have any other questions from members of the commission? Hearing none. Jeff, any final points for the good of the cause? Tony?
Well, Tony, you're on mute. I'll just say I have no other points.
Okay, very good. I want to go now, if I may, to an issue that's been brought to our attention, and I'm going to credit our Vice Chairwoman, Ms. Wall, for raising this issue, and it involves our third-party distributors that now operate in the state of Maryland. And again, one of the responsibilities that we have as regulators is to keep abreast of and remain in front of evolutions within the marketplace. And one of the things that we've seen in recent months and over the past couple of years is the emergence of these I call them third-party distribution entities that will bring alcohol products, upon demand to your doorstep, just like you would get a pizza or a meal or something else. And I'm going to turn over to Barbara, because apparently, Barbara, you have had you've been made aware of a couple of complaints about inadequate verification of ages and things like that. These entities are supposed to do as due diligence in order to ensure that we're not handing alcohol beverages off to people who aren't authorized to receive them. So I'd like to turn it over to Barbara and then ask Jeff and Tony to talk about what we're doing to regulate and to ensure that these entities are compliant with state and local laws. Barbara?
Yeah. So a community member reached out to me and wanted to bring it to our attention. He had witnessed delivery by the vendor Drizzly, product going to a house, and didn't appear that anybody was checking for identification when the delivery was made. And so he wasn't saying that what he witnessed was delivered to a minor, but he was very concerned how easy it would be for it to be delivered to a minor. And I will share with the group that I have used the vendor Drizzly in the past, and I think I used it twice. And one time I was not asked for ID, and one time I was asked for ID. So I can validate my own experience that, these things do happen, but definitely worth being able to communicate where the safeguards in and enforce those. So that was the issue that came up.
Thank you, Barbara.
I think Drizzly was allowed in Maryland.
Tony, Jeff, could you speak to that for a second?
I'll speak to it quickly and then Jeff kick in because he knows a lot more about it than I do with what's been going on in the past couple of years. But home delivery is permitted if the retailer has the written authorization of the local board, from what I understand. The situation that Barbara is relating to, what Jeff and I have discussed, is possibly what's occurred. This Delvey service that's been used acts as a go-between between a realtor, or retailer rather, and the consumer, putting the two in contact each other in some fashion. And then the retailer is supposed to be having one of its employees, under the permission of the local board, make that delivery. If we have complaints of this kind of activity that appears to be illegally going on, we have investigated in the past. And we would probably investigate again if we have direct information about what's going on, and we would look into it. And if it's worth an investigation, we would assign an agent to look into it and see what we find out. Jeff, you got anything further?
I think you covered that well, Tony. I'll just say this. There are no third-party delivery services in Maryland. They're not allowed. If they're operating illegally. Drizzly, and there have been a couple of others that have tried to exist, but Drizzly's one of them that does have a footprint in Maryland. Their footprint is all app-driven. They are simply a broker. When you go to a Drizzly app, you are not asking, you might think you're asking Drizzly to make a delivery, but the reality is what you're asking is for Drizzly to hook you up with a retailer in your home jurisdiction, because they can only deliver from a liquor store in the same jurisdiction, the 23 counties or Baltimore or Annapolis City that you reside in. You're simply asking Drizzly to hook you up with one of your local retailers who's received permission from their local board to make home deliveries. And when you actually consummate the transaction, in actuality, that is taking place between you and your retailer, and delivery is being made by the retailer or the retailer's employee. They can't throw it in a cab. They can't throw it in an Uber or a Grubhub or a DoorDash or any of the others. They can't make delivery that way. And Drizzly never does it all. They don't have, I'm not even sure there would be an employee of Drizzly. I think they're in Boston or something. So there's probably not even an employee that resides in Maryland for Drizzly. So it's not them. The issue that happened in any of these circumstances you may have heard about has to be the local retailer who made the delivery failed to check ID properly. They failed to follow protocol, which is maybe a violation of law and certainly a violation of the regulations they're supposed to adhere to. And like Tony said, considering we have a handful of agents, not a lot, to cover the state, we need credible information. But if we have credible information, we will do that investigation, including setting up a sting delivery to either verify they're doing properly or not. And we've done that in the past. And we've verified sometimes they are doing it right, and sometimes we've caught them doing it wrong, and we hold them accountable. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that to demonstrate there are no authorized delivery systems. The closest we get is a retailer allowed to use an employee of the retailer to make delivery. Even with the governor's executive order, the delivery people still have to be employees of the restaurants or taverns who are allowed to make those deliveries. No third party, otherwise uninvolved entity.
So Jeff, let me follow up with that. So as you pointed out, and as Tony pointed out, Drizzly acts essentially as an administrative broker to connect the customer with the local liquor store, almost like a flowers.com type arrangement. I guess one question I would have is, would a Drizzly or another player in this market space have any obligation to ensure that its local partners are indeed compliant with state and local regulations and laws? I mean, because while the local retailer is the back end support, obviously they're the ones that actually show up at the door, the public facing, the outward facing entity with the consumer is Drizzly. So is there any due diligence that we're aware of that's conducted by Drizzly to make sure that they are indeed doing business with reputable local partners?
Yeah, first of all, none of those entities or platforms are regulated, and they're not required to be. Drizzly, I just happen to have a little knowledge of because we looked into this. It was one of the first ones, and the first ones to come in the state. So we spent a lot of time looking into it. And their self-stated rules and protocols require them to verify that any of their partner retailers in our state have to verify and be able to verify or do verify that they have, one, a license, and second, a letter of authority from the local board to make deliveries directly to consumers. Okay. Now it's self-imposed, and it only makes sense for Drizzly to adhere to that. That's their business. That is their business. So if they fail to do that, then they fail to bring on additional retailers at that point.
And it's probably not the worst idea to mention at this time that under the current legal and regulatory framework, this ATC is the chief regulator of the manufacturing and distribution sectors, but the retail sector is regulated by the local liquor boards.
Yep, that's right. Now, again, the ATC will have considerable authority and responsibility, quite frankly, to investigate local violations, to find these violations on its own, but the recourse at that point is to report it to the local board for their regulatory action or follow-up.
Got it. And Jeff, obviously, to the extent that these complaints come in, hopefully we won't have any more, but to the extent that we are aware of local retailers not exercising due diligence, you and staff will obviously be in contact with the appropriate local authorities, correct, for their follow-up and action?
Yeah, actually, even more accurately, Len, I think what we'd be doing is conducting a sting. I mean, we are equipped to do that. We are allowed to do that. And when I say we, I mean now collectively the ATC and the FED of the Comptroller's Office through our memorandum of understanding. We would be doing this really under Tony's authority. We conduct sting operations. We'll go ahead and make a delivery and require a delivery from that retailer and see what protocols they follow. And then if they're in violation, we write up a very detailed police-style violation report and submit it to the local board for follow-up action. And then what happens, just to finish it off, what happens is local board schedules a hearing and calls our agent or inspectors in as witnesses.
Got it. Are there any questions from the commissioners on this item?
Yeah, I do have one question then, since we're on this topic. Why then are third-party distributors not allowed in the state of Maryland?
So I'm going to go back to what I'll call rule number one. If they don't say you can, you can't. There isn't any provision for it. There's no law that says we can have third-party providers. And again, with alcohol law, if it's not expressly authorized, then it's not allowed. It's illegal.
That's
And
the answer.
there have been attempts. What's that?
That's the answer of the day, man.
Hey, rule one.
In other words, call your delegate.
Yeah. If you want them, then you got to do that. But but let me. But seriously, and you know, there's got to be control to that, because at least when you have an employee of a liquor store making the delivery, that liquor store licensee has everything at risk. They have every reason to do it right. A violation of that delivery means they lose their license potentially and their livelihood. If Uber Eats drops off a bottle and they're allowed to do it and they have no skin in the game at all, what stops anybody from doing it and ever controlling this? We have an obligation to control this product and make it as safe as we can. And that's part of it. And I think that's another reason why third-party entities can't simply make delivery. And I don't know if we should be in favor of something like that unless there's a lot of discussion and a lot of rules set up under which they're allowed to make these deliveries.
Well, Jeff, it seems to me this is probably a good jumping off point to get into our legislative update, because I think there are a couple of pieces of legislation regarding the ability of retailers to retain their delivery privileges and their carryout privileges that we need to discuss. So why don't we hop right into it if we can?
Sure, happy to. What I'm going to talk about real quick are the statewide bills only, the tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock bills. There's only a handful of them, so it won't be too terribly long. I'll say this, I'll be talking about them, but if you don't have a point of reference, it might sound a little confusing. I apologize for that, and eventually it'll start to make sense. But if you do have some understanding of it and you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So the first statewide bill I wanted to bring up was House Bill 12, and there is a complementary cross-filed bill in the Senate. This deals with delivery of product from what we call an off-premise location. Off-premise simply means they sell alcohol to be consumed somewhere other than at that location. Think of a packaged goods store. When we say on-premise, we mean a bar, a tavern, a restaurant, a place where you consume it on-premise. So this is for off-premise, and essentially, this is just kind of making permanent the privileges that they've had for making deliveries under the governor's executive order, and it requires that a certain amount that they sell. But if they're going to do this, they have to have a certain amount of food and certain things like that. So it's really just this is the beginning of starting to memorialize some of what the governor's been allowing, and we're now into this for 11 months. So We're starting to get a sense what works and what doesn't work. There may be some amendments to the bill generally, but it's not a surprise that it came up, and it's not a real stretch from anything we've been doing for the last 11 months. The next bill was House Bill 185. This is okay. Now this is an interesting bill. This bill, it seems to me, what this bill does is it eliminates minimum purchases to go into a place. Some locations would have other entertainment perhaps, and would say you have a 2-drink minimum in order to come in and listen to our music. This bill seems to just eliminate the number of drinks that are required in order to enter into a location. This was a Delegate Branch introduced this bill. So I think it just simply eliminates covers. Or not covers, minimum drink requirements. The third bill is House Bill, and none of these so far. I'll let you know if it's one that I think you might really want to pay attention to because it may impact some of the work you do. House Bill 422, simply a study. The ATC is only directed to be a cooperative entity or body of information to whoever's going to conduct the study, which is not you. This is a study to determine and evaluate minority participation in the alcoholic beverages industry generally. That also has a cross-filed Senate bill. House Bill 506, I'll spend 2 seconds. Yes, sir.
Hey, Jeff, who's moving the 2 bills on the study?
It's Delegate Barnes and Senator Patterson.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yep, you bet. The next bill, I'll spend just a couple of seconds on. It's House Bill 506. It's kind of written like a local bill. I'm not sure why it's got state bill access, but Baltimore City's kind of interesting. Like I said, Maryland decided that all local jurisdictions can do things the way they want to do them. Talbot County's kind of nuts too, isn't it, Len? They do whatever they want.
Well, I mean, your definition of nuts may be, based upon where you live. I mean,
yeah.
To you, it may be a godsend. I don't know.
So it's nuts. So you're right. I don't live in Talbot. So
if my friend Mr. Farrar was on the call, he'd say what's happening in Talbot is nuts.
Yeah.
If I'm on my way home and I like stopping by Harris Teeter, which I would never do because I always patronize my local, package stores, I may find it to be quite beneficial. But we do have a unique regulatory schematic.
The peculiarities amongst the jurisdictions is interesting, and Talbot is the one jurisdiction that kind of gets to decide what it wants to do completely outside of state rule, although state rule governs the rest of the state. But Baltimore City also has some unique things as well, and based on different legislative districts they have different rules. And I've sometimes seen this drawn up where the lines are drawn up from an address or an odd side of a street where certain rules apply, but they don't apply on the other side. So this one just has to deal with the districting plans of Baltimore. Won't spend any time on that. House Bill 944 is an interesting bill. What it seems to do to me, it deals with delivery, what we were just talking about, delivery from a retail Class A. When I say Class A, that goes back to off-premise, think packaged goods. It's about delivering alcohol from a Class A to a consumer. No problem. Current law says if you want to deliver from your Class A off-premise location, you got to contact your local board and you get a written letter of authority or approval from your local board. And once you get that, feel free. You can now be affiliated with Drizzly. You can make deliveries to consumers. This bill seems to take it a little bit further, and it seems to allow, not based on a letter of approval or authority, but simply a letter of notification that you're going to make a delivery into a local jurisdiction. So Jeff Kelly's packaged goods store in Anne Arundel County is going to contact that Talbot County store that Len likes to go to at Talbot County and say, I'm making a delivery in your county now to Len. I'm bypassing everybody and making a delivery. In existing law, can't do it. I can only make a delivery to somebody in Anne Arundel County. But this seems to allow that to go. A retailer can deliver anywhere in the state, and not by getting approval, not by getting a permit, but by simply telling the local board they're going to do that. If somebody reads that differently, I'd like to hear about it. If anybody out there hears it differently, I'd like to hear about it. But that's what it seems to say to me.
So, Jeff, I have a question on that. This is a really curious bill to me. I have 2 questions. First, how does that conform to provisions of home rule? And I'm thinking about a place like Baltimore County, which for better or worse is still a dry county on Sundays. So what happens if a retailer from Howard County sends a letter to the county liquor board of notification, not requesting permission, that, hey, we're going to start moving product into Baltimore County on Sundays? Are there provisions of law that would allow Baltimore County to exercise its home rule prerogatives and supersede the state legislation, which would grant that retailer permission to come on in?
Thanks for that question. You're going to make me answer this in a way I hate to answer it. I don't know. I'm not sure. Baltimore County, as you stated, generally speaking, deliveries, sales can't be made. Packaged goods store sales can't be made in Baltimore on Sundays in Baltimore County. But as I read this bill, it doesn't seem to say that you have to, one, you don't have to get a permit from the county you want to deliver to. You simply make a notification of what you're going to do. And it doesn't say you have to adhere to the rules of that county necessarily. So it's not clear to me that if you're in Howard County that you couldn't make that delivery on Sunday when the liquor store right down the street can't even open up for business that day. It's just not clear. I don't know. I don't know.
And I don't mean to monopolize the conversation, but my second and final question on this one is, if the control of the flow of alcohol into the county is being removed from the oversight of the local liquor board, which entity is? I mean, and if we're talking about transactions that occur across jurisdictional lines, who's the enforcement authority? Is it the place of origin or is it the place of destination?
I guess I can only say yes. I don't know. It doesn't say. That's part of the inherent problem with this, I think. If you are the Howard County retailer and you commit the violation in Howard County, it's very clear that Howard County is going to deal with you. If you're the Howard County retailer who, let's just say, makes a delivery into Baltimore County on a Sunday to an underage consumer, it's not clear to me that your Howard County license is in jeopardy. And going back to what I said earlier about deliveries generally, what's your skin in the game? If you can make that delivery and you don't have to answer to your home licensing authority, then who do you answer to in this other jurisdiction when you make that sale? I don't know. It seems to me if you're going to do this, you at a minimum would need some kind of a permission, not a statement you're going to do it, but permission from that county, and maybe even more so, a permit that allows you to do it, and something you could lose if you do it in violation of one of that local jurisdiction's laws or regulations. It's just not clear to me. And again, I don't know it all about this stuff, but I haven't heard explained any way that makes sense to answer any of the questions you've asked.
Well, it sounds like that could be an interesting bill hearing at tomorrow's Booze Day.
Tune in at 11.
Which begins at 11 o'clock at a time and place near you. Go ahead, Jeff. I apologize for.
Sure, no worries. Two more. House Bill 996 is it's a very interesting bill because everything about this bill is about healthy foods. This bill exists, I think it exists to address what we would call food deserts. This bill allows grocery stores and perhaps chain stores to receive liquor licenses, beer and wine licenses, I believe, either beer or beer and wine. In Maryland, we don't allow chain stores to have liquor licenses. We don't allow grocery stores to have liquor licenses. There are some, but those are ones that were grandfathered in before it became illegal. It doesn't allow any new ones. This one would not only allow a grocery store that moved into a priority funding area, it has to move into that area, but once it makes that qualification, and several others, like they have to sell maybe 5 of 6 items or 6 of 7 items like fresh meat, produce. The idea is well intended, I think. But once they do that, it doesn't say they're eligible to receive. It says, or to apply for a license, it says a local board will issue that license, shall issue that license. So if a grocery store meeting all the requirements moves into the right place, they simply have to call their local liquor board up and say, give me my license now, please. So it's interesting. I do think the intent of this is to satisfy concerns about food deserts and to get good quality, healthy food into areas where it's not now. But, oftentimes there are other consequences involved. There may not be any bad consequences here, or there may. But I think that's what this bill is trying to do. It's one that I don't think requires anything from you guys, but it's certainly one that's interesting to follow.
Who put that in?
That was in by, and I'm going to hope I pronounce this, Delegate Gee. It's Q-I, or it's Gee. I think it would be pronounced Gee.
Yeah.
Montgomery County,
Yeah.
District 15.
And Jeff, how, I apologize for kind of scratching my head on this, but how does HB 996 address a food desert when it's requiring organizations to sell alcohol?
That's a good question. I'm chuckling to myself because I'm going to give you an example that just gets me. But again, the stated reason, the reason I believe they're doing that is make it as attractive and as profitable as possible for a grocery store to bring fresh, quality food into an area that lacks it. And in part doing that by allowing it to sell alcohol, which is typically a pretty decent source of revenue generation. The little story that makes me chuckle about this is several years ago, there was a Harris Teeter brought into Baltimore City, and it was appeared to be given. Yeah,
I remember this.
Now Len's chuckling too. Appeared to be given a liquor license, in contrast to law that says a grocery store, and even more a chain store, can't have a liquor license. But they got it, and they got it through a variety of means that took place kind of quietly, and no one knew about it for over a year. They had this license because they weren't in operation, and no one knew about it. But the reason was Harris Teeter wasn't interested in moving into this location unless they could get the valuable liquor license, because that's what made it worthwhile for them to move into the location. Now, I think they're using that. No, that's the example. They're not using that, but that's the example of why they might allow a store with fresh quality product, entice them, quite frankly, into moving into certain areas so they can get the valuable earnings potential of the alcohol while at the same time providing much needed quality food items to local residents.
And is there any stipulation in that bill that would require the quality of food? In other words, you have a bag of chips and a pack of bologna. That's not going to quite fit the food desert standard.
No, you're right. It does. It lists a variety of what we would consider perhaps healthy foods, fresh meats, dairy, produce. I think it mentions like maybe 7 different items. I'm doing this from recollection. I read this a while back now, but it's a handful of items that it says you must sell like 5 of the 6 or 6 of the 7 of these items must be available in your store to qualify to qualify to be this entity that's also allowed to ask for the liquor license. So it does mandate the quality be there first.
So this is the only grocery store bill that's in this year.
I think so. I'm qualifying my answer by saying it's the only statewide grocery store bill that's in so far this year. As I mentioned, there are a ton of liquor bills, which I won't get into because they're usually just little. Right. If somebody has an interest in one, I'm happy to look it up and get back. But they're usually just very parochial.
I just have one quick question about the same bill. Is there any provision that requires the revenue raised from those alcohol sales to stay within the communities that are food deserts?
Perfect question. I believe there is. And yes, again, I'm glad you said it because it's been a little while since I looked at this. I believe the revenues, not from the grocery store, but the revenues generated from the licensing fees, I believe. And now I think I'm accurate. Boy, I might be conflating a couple of bills. I think there was something about the licensing fees generated by this go to ultimately a fund. And again, I apologize for not remembering all this, but that's in further support of communities that need help. Tony, is that do you recall that? I think that's right.
I seem to remember there was a fund that it was supposed to go to. I'm going to look the bill up real quick.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's the commission, any revenues the commission receives for licensing this go to a fund. That is all administered. That's administered by an entirely different agency.
And Jeff, you said this bill and House Bill 944 were both sponsored by Delegate Key?
That's correct.
Okay. Are there any other questions about the legislative overview? Anybody? Okay.
Thank you.
Moving on, just under new business, we have a couple of things to tend to next month. I just want to throw the topic out just to get everyone thinking. we're going to have to arrive at a consensus on how we want to run our meetings, whether we choose to observe Robert's Rules of Order or another set protocol. But I'm going to ask that staff and legal counsel, Mr. Singerman, work with us offline between now and March to come up with a proposed menu of recommendations, and we can discuss it more at our March meeting. So just wanted to get everyone thinking about that. Do we have any other new business for discussion?
I do have the answer to your question previously made in regards to how many dispensaries we have. We have 139 licensed dispensaries.
139. Interesting. Thank you, Tony.
And on this bill we were just talking about, I found one reference to a fund that money's supposed to go to, and it's called the Community Legacy Financial Assistance Fund.
And who administers that, Tony?
I believe the controller administers it.
Okay.
Yeah, it says the state treasurer shall hold and the controller shall account for the fund.
Thank you.
Interesting. Okay. If there are no other items of new business to discuss, no other questions, I'd like a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Adjourn.
Second.
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 All those in favor? Aye. All
Aye.
those opposed? Meeting is adjourned, and we will meet again. What's our next meeting day? It's the third Thursday in March, but what date is that, Tony?
1 second. That would be the 18th.
The 18th. Got it. Okay. And I will, as always, be sending out requests for agenda topics. And if you have anything that you need clarification on from this meeting, please follow up with Tony or Jeff or Mr. Singerman. Thanks, everyone. Have a good weekend. And to the staff and to our stakeholders, happy Booze Day tomorrow.
Hey,
Good
Jeff.
luck.
Jeff Kelly, that was a great presentation. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate that.